have this ceremonial system called Kula where they exchange gifts with each other at a certain time of year. It's a very important thing that anthropologists have studied. Okay. Gertz mentions it in passing, so I wanted to mention it too, but not that important. Semiotics is a little bit more important, as you'll see, to what Gertz is talking about. Semiotics is the study of signs and symbols and their use. Okay. It's very clear that human society and culture is made up in a large part of signs. It's not just made up of material actions. There are a bunch of material actions that went into making up this phone, but the phone also has a lot of signs involved. First, there's numbers and language, which are signs that I use in order to manipulate the phone. There's also the brand mark, right, which I might recognize as one that I do or don't trust, or that I have certain loyalty towards, or what have you, right? There's also what this phone says about me. It's a sign of me, right? I'm not using an iPhone, I'm not that hip, right? I'm this guy that uses this phone, right? So again, things in culture in general are signs. All of language is signs, but the way you dress is a sign. Other people interpret it. If other people interpret it, it's a sign or a symbol. We've talked before about how a crucifix is a sign, or a Star of David can be a sign of Judaism, and so on and so on. So different sorts of things can be signs. And Gertz is generally talking about culture as made up of signs. Okay, so that's just getting the vocabulary out of the way. Let's start with Harris. What did you guys think of Harris? Anybody? Anybody have anything positive to say about Harris? Sarah Reardon, what did you think of Harris?
I honestly couldn't understand the single thing I read.
What's that?
I honestly couldn't understand the single thing I read.
You couldn't understand a single thing. Not a single thing? Okay. Josh, anything from Harris? Okay. So we need to talk about Harris. Harris's basic point of view, the way that he describes himself, is as a cultural materialist. Right? That means, first of all, that he's going to be thinking about culture in material terms. What matters about culture is what's material to culture. Okay? And what's material to culture is both the artifacts of culture, right? Like this phone was made by a certain culture. It was made by, I don't know, what is it, LG? LG is a Korean company? Anyone know? Anyway, imported for the American market, probably manufactured in China. Who knows? It's made within the context of a certain international consumer culture. In this case, this is probably specialized for the US market, so it belongs to the US market in some ways. So that's material. My actions are also material. The language I'm speaking is material, right? So Harris is saying what matters about culture is the material, okay? And the material matters in a certain kind of way, as we can see. But let's start off by asking, why is cultural materialism important? Okay? And the reason why cultural materialism is important for Harris is because he believes it's the way that anthropology can be made into a nomothetic science. So what is nomothetic again? You said it a couple minutes ago. Yeah.
Related to the study of general scientific law.
General scientific laws, thank you. So, yeah. Right, Harris is saying anthropology can be made into a nomothetic science, a science bound by laws, the same way physics has the law of gravity. Anthropology can have certain laws if it's cultural materialist. So to do that, he wants to talk about what science is. Can anybody find the part in the Harris where he describes what he thinks science is? And I know we're lacking page numbers in the Harris, so please add them in case you need them for later. The first page in Harris is page 4. So the first one's 4, and then you can count forward. Does anybody know? Can anybody tell me where he describes the epistemological principles of science? On what page? People have the copy.
Page 5.
Page 5. What's the section?
Epistemological principles of science.
Yes. That's where he explains the epistemology. That's helpful, right? The principles of science are explained here. So what are they? They're numbered, right? Some of these are vocabulary words that I included there on the sheet that you'll have to look up for yourself. Well, we can talk about them. One is that science is predictive. What does it mean that science is predictive? Kyle, what does it mean that science is predictive?
You could make like a guess what's going to happen.
Science predicts what's going to happen when I drop the chalk, right? Science predicts what's going to happen when this room is subject to 10,000 times the normal level of radiation, right? Which is we all get sick, right? Science is going to predict what happens, when we had these examples when a frog is subject to a certain kind of chemical pollution and so on. Science makes predictions about the world, okay? So if anthropology is to be a science, it has to predict how cultures are going to change and how cultures are going to, what kind of values cultures are going to have, what kind of ideas cultures are going to have. Even before we discover a culture, we should know something about it and be able to make some predictions. Science is testable. Right? So science means that you can test things, right? If you have a theory of the way the world works, if it's non-testable, it's not science. What if I told you all, in addition to all the other things that we know about the universe, that there's matter and energy, and these take the form of radiation and protons and neutrinos and all these different little particles and all whatnot. What if I told you in addition to all that stuff, the universe is also filled with blue goo? And blue goo is everywhere. And you can't touch it, or taste it, or smell it, or see it, or hear it, or detect it with any instruments. But nevertheless, blue goo is everywhere. Is this a scientific theory? No, why? It's not testable. All I told you is that blue goo exists everywhere, but that you can't discover it. You just can't, you can't. There's only way to know about blue goo is to feel it in your heart, right? That's not testable, right? So because it's not testable, it's not science, right? This is often the case with religious propositions. There's many scientists who think there's nothing wrong with all sorts of religious propositions. They're just not science because they're not testable. Many of them believe religious propositions. They just believe they're not testable, right? Okay, now science is also parsimonious. Does anyone know what parsimonious means? Parsimonious, when referring to money, means using as little money as possible. In this case, it means using as few words or ideas as possible. Scientific theories should be as short as possible. If I have a scientific theory that's overly complex, that says gravity works, but it depends on another force that's called gravity or gravity or whatever, right? And I create some whole other force that explains how gravity works, and say that this force called gravity explains both gravity and the way that people perceive color, right? That doesn't make any sense. Your scientific theory should be as simple as possible. It should explain one phenomenon at a time. In the case of the law of gravity, it should just explain the way that bodies with mass attract one another. The Earth has a huge mass, so it attracts this chalk, and the chalk drops. Right? If you were on a planet that's much smaller, the chalk would drop slower, or at least accelerate less quickly. Okay. Also, science should have a broad scope. Am I following along the text here pretty well? Broad scope, right? Science should explain a lot of things and not just one thing. My scientific theory should not be that the law of gravity works in this classroom. My scientific theory should be that the law of gravity works throughout the universe, right? So science should have a broad scope. It should also be integrable or integratable, as he says. By which he means you can integrate different ideas. So you can, physicists famously try to integrate the law of gravity with other physical forces like the nuclear force, the strong weak nuclear force, and so on. Right? There are other forces in the universe according to physicists. And people have made an attempt to integrate the law of gravity with those other forces, magnetism and so on, and explain how all these forces relate to each other.